whether in the Russia-Ukraine negotiations or Russia-US dialogues. The conditions set by Putin internally boil down to what the Russians describe as eliminating the motivations and causes that led to the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war on February 24, 2022. In the past 2 days, we have noted that Russian President Putin will have a phone conversation with US President Trump tonight, Beijing time, the third such conversation between the two this year, following previous calls in mid-February and mid-March. This third conversation is particularly significant, coming after the first formal, albeit low-level, bilateral engagement between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul last Thursday since the war began. Notably, US Middle East envoy Stephen Witkoff, a figure Trump clearly trusts, has been tasked with representing Trump in direct talks with Putin despite his official role on Middle East issues. Witkoff revealed that he believes this conversation between the Russian and US leaders will be a great success. How can Witkoff predict with such certainty that his boss and Putin will achieve great success before the conversation even takes place? The reason is simple. As a trusted aide appointed by Trump to engage in private and secret communications with Putin, he must have already brokered many deals on his boss's behalf. In other words, the phone call between Trump and Putin at 10 p.m. Beijing time tonight will merely be the final confirmation of agreements already reached between Witkoff and Putin, a symbolic gesture. This, incidentally, also reflects to some extent the naivety of Zelensky, who travelled to Ankara last week only to be outmaneuvered by Putin. So, what kind of deals might be struck between the two countries, between Putin and Trump? To answer this, we need to examine recent internal views in Russia. Based on information gathered from Russian sources, the following key points can be summarized. First, there has been a consistent internal narrative in Russia that, whether in Russia-Ukraine negotiations or Russia-US dialogues, the bottom line or conditions set by Putin internally are, using Russian terminology to make the causes English term used by the original text of the February 4, 2022 war disappear. This statement is abstract and euphemistic, but also quite direct. To understand this, we only need to look at the motivations behind the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war on February 20, 2020 to note, likely a typo. Should be February 24, 2022 as perceived by Russia. The first motivation cited by Russia was that Ukraine must not join NATO. The direct trigger was Ukraine's request to join NATO. The second was that the so-called Nazi government in Ukraine must be eliminated and foreign troops must not be stationed on Ukrainian soil, among other demands. Regarding the first point, after 3 years of war, both Ukraine and Western countries have largely abandoned the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. The US has no internal objections to this. US President Biden himself has said that if Putin accepts a ceasefire or peace agreement, he will ensure that Ukraine does not join NATO for 20 years. It is said that Russia has also demanded a US commitment that Ukraine will permanently not join NATO, so this issue is not a major obstacle. The second point is the denazification of Ukraine. What does this mean? The Russian side, particularly Putin, has long believed that there is a Nazi tendency within Ukraine, primarily represented by the Zelensky government. In other words, this amounts to a demand for regime change. The current Zelensky regime must be removed from power. Moreover, Putin believes that Zelensky's term of office has already expired, but due to the war, elections have not been held. This is frankly one of the reasons Putin has been reluctant to engage in direct dialogue with Zelensky. For Zelensky, this is not a matter of life and death. He has already signaled his readiness to step down for peace. However, Russia's concept of denazification in Ukraine goes beyond replacing Zelensky and his government. It requires installing a pro-Russian government. Moreover, the so-called denazification must also extend to the Ukrainian military and government. What does this imply? It means a thorough purge within the ranks of the Ukrainian military and government. Initially, when Putin launched the Russia-Ukraine war on February 24, 2022, he intended to use a blitzkrieg to subdue Ukraine and then personally address these issues. However, the war did not go as planned. But then, out of the blue, along came a Jin, an unexpected figure in the form of Trump, who seemed willing to help resolve these matters. If I were Putin, I would also seize the opportunity to impose these conditions on Trump. This is likely to be the toughest nut to crack in tonight's conversation. regarding the ownership of Crimea and the 4 eastern Ukrainian regions, with Russia claiming sovereignty over them. These are surely among the conditions Putin will put forward. If Trump can meet all these conditions, a ceasefire may be possible. But if that happens, it would mean that, at least on the surface and in the short term, the more than 3-year-long Russia-Ukraine war would end with Putin achieving all his goals. It would also mean a complete failure for Western countries led by the United States, specifically the Biden-led US government in the past, which have been aiding Ukraine in resisting Russia's military offensive. Whether this outcome is good or bad is not for me to judge here. I think these are the basic elements we can anticipate if the great success as predicted by Witkoff is to be achieved. Of course, it will be difficult for Trump to agree to all of these demands at this moment. He has to consider his domestic voter base and public opinion in the United States. However, it is likely that Trump will be willing to agree to most of them. Now, let's analyze which of Putin's conditions Trump is likely to accept and which ones will be extremely difficult for him to agree to, at least for now. First, preventing Ukraine from joining NATO, either in the long term or permanently, is something Trump can readily agree to. Second, Trump may also be willing to recognize Russia's long-term control over Crimea and the 4 eastern Ukrainian regions. But for Ukraine, a sovereign and independent country, having its fate decided by Trump and Putin is a humiliation. This, however, is the harsh reality of international politics. A weak country is bound to be bullied. A crucial detail now is whether Trump will agree to Russia having full sovereignty over Crimea and the 4 eastern Ukrainian regions or just administrative control. This is likely to be a point of contention in tonight's conversation. Third, the complete overthrow of the current Ukrainian regime and the so-called denazification purge within the Ukrainian government and military is an open question. It's uncertain whether Trump can or dares to agree to this, and to what extent. Although Trump may not have a favorable opinion of Zelensky, the United States is still a so-called democratic country, and Trump has to follow certain procedures. Trump has already said that after his call with Putin, he will immediately talk to Zelensky and also communicate with NATO representatives, including the NATO Secretary General. After all, the United States is a member of NATO. So, it is highly unlikely that Trump will completely agree to all of Putin's conditions, at least tonight. If an agreement is reached, Putin may agree to a ceasefire lasting at least 1 month, perhaps even 3 months, gradually leading to a long-term peace. This would be exactly what the United States, or rather Trump, desires, as he hopes to normalize relations with Russia. Once the Russia-Ukraine war comes to an end and Russia-US relations are normalized, although we may hope for the best from the perspective of people-to-people governance, it will be very interesting to observe the direct and indirect impacts on China. Thank you all for your attention. See you at the same time tomorrow. Thank you.